I was sitting across from my daughter-in-law in the very restaurant I built with my own hands when I realized she had no idea who she was trying to destroy. My name is Charles Morrow. I'm 63 years old, and 14 months ago I had a stroke in the walk-in freezer of Morrow's Kitchen, the family restaurant I opened in 1991. My wife, Paulette, found me on the floor between the shelving units, surrounded by frozen salmon and boxes of produce. She said I looked like I'd just decided to lie down and take a nap. I don't remember any of it. One moment I was checking inventory, the next I was waking up in a hospital bed, with the left side of my face feeling like it belonged to someone else. The doctors said I was lucky. Mild ischemic stroke, they called it. Left side weakness, some speech difficulty, nothing permanent if I rested and followed protocol. What they didn't say was that while I was learning to hold a fork again in occupational therapy, my daughter-in-law was restructuring the business my wife and I had spent 32 years building. My son, Ryan, had been working at the restaurant since he was 16. He bussed tables, learned the line, eventually managed weekend service. When I got sick, he stepped in to run operations, which I expected and appreciated. What I didn't expect was his wife, Tiffany, stepping in beside him and gradually replacing every decision I'd ever made. Tiffany had an MBA from a school I'd never heard of and a way of speaking in meetings that made you feel like you were already behind. She used phrases like legacy burden and underperforming emotional assets. I'd been running a profitable 40-seat restaurant in Knoxville for over 3 decades, and she was explaining to my own chef that his recipes needed brand alignment. I should have seen the signs earlier, but you don't look for fires when you're still learning to walk straight again. The first thing I noticed when I came home from the rehab facility was the sign, not the banner my grandchildren had made me, though that was there too, taped crookedly to the mailbox with the letter E in Welcome Backward the way kids do it. What I noticed was that the sign above Morrow's Kitchen had been replaced. For 30 years it had been hand-lettered wood, dark green with gold paint, my wife's handwriting, because she had the steadiest hand of anyone I'd ever known. The new sign was backlit acrylic, sans font, MK Kitchen and Bar. I asked Ryan about it on the ride home from the facility. Tiffany ran some focus groups, he said. Apparently the old branding tested as dated. Paulette reached over and put her hand on my knee from the back seat. She'd learned to do that when she sensed I was about to say something I'd regret. I didn't say anything. I watched the sign pass by the window. The second thing I noticed was that Vic wasn't there anymore. Victor, he'd gone by Vic his entire life, had been my head chef for 19 years. He'd come in as a prep cook at 24, with a culinary school certificate and a bad knee from playing semi-pro baseball, and I'd watched him grow into one of the best scratch cooks in eastern Tennessee. His shrimp and grits had been written up in a regional food magazine twice. People drove from Chattanooga for his Sunday pot roast. Ryan told me Vic had transitioned out while I was in recovery. When I pressed him, he said Tiffany had determined that the kitchen needed culinary modernization and had brought in a consultant who worked with hotel restaurants. The new menu had 12 items instead of 28. Half of them had names I couldn't pronounce. I asked Ryan what happened to the shrimp and grits. He looked at his shoes. It didn't make the cut. That night, after Paulette had gone to bed and the house was quiet, I sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and started writing things down. The sign. Vic. The menu. A call I'd overheard Ryan take on his phone the week before I was discharged. Something about a lease negotiation. I didn't know what lease. We owned the building. Or I thought we did. I called my accountant in the morning. His name is Walt, and he'd done our books since 2004. He answered on the second ring, which told me he'd been expecting my call. Charles, he said. I'm glad you're home. We need to talk. He came to the house that afternoon with a folder that was 3 inches thick. I made coffee while Paulette sat at the table across from him and did the thing she did when she was frightened. She held her own hands. The folder contained, among other things, a lease amendment for the building that housed the restaurant, the building I owned. The amendment had converted our ownership to a long-term leasehold arrangement with a holding company called Bright Fork Properties, LLC. The lease was for 49 years at a rate that was below market. Bright Fork Properties LLC had been registered in Tennessee 4 months earlier. Ryan's name wasn't on it. Tiffany's wasn't either, technically. The registered agent was a name I didn't recognize. But Walt had done some digging. The LLC is controlled by a trust, he told me. The trust beneficiary is your son. I sat there for a long time. I signed this? My speech was still a little slow when I was tired or stressed. The words came out like they were being pulled through water. Walt looked uncomfortable. There's a signature, dated 6 weeks after your stroke. 6 weeks after my stroke, I had been in a rehabilitation facility relearning how to button a shirt. I knew my own signature. I'd been signing checks and contracts and vendor agreements for 30 years. The signature on the lease amendment was close. Close enough that a stranger wouldn't question it. But the way my capital C curled at the bottom, the small break I always made between the M and the O in Morrow, those weren't right. Someone who'd watched me sign things many times had tried to replicate it, and they'd almost succeeded. Almost. I didn't call a lawyer that day. I didn't call Ryan. I went back to the kitchen table after Walt left, and I wrote more things on my legal pad. I wrote down everything I knew, everything I suspected, and everything I needed to confirm. Then I went to bed and slept for 10 hours, which was the most I'd slept since the stroke. Paulette didn't ask what Walt and I had talked about. She had a way of knowing when to give me room. She just set a glass of water on the nightstand and turned off the light. The next 2 weeks, I moved quietly. I called Dr. Anita Bott, my neurologist, and asked her to pull my complete chart for the 6 weeks following my stroke. Specifically, any documentation of my cognitive and decision-making capacity. She knew immediately why I was asking. You were not cleared for any legal or financial decisions during that period, she told me. I have it in writing. We were actually concerned about your comprehension in week 3. Then I called my attorney. Her name is Judith Park, and she'd handled our business incorporation back in 1991, drafted our first commercial lease, and helped us navigate a zoning dispute in 2009. She's the kind of lawyer who speaks slowly because she's thinking twice as fast as everyone else in the room. I explained what Walt had found. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Send me the documents. Don't discuss this with Ryan or Tiffany. Don't change anything about your routine." I asked her what she thought we were dealing with. Document fraud, at minimum, she said. Depending on the structure of the LLC, potentially elder financial abuse under Tennessee statute. That carries criminal exposure. Criminal exposure. My son's name in the same sentence as that phrase. I wrote it down on my legal pad anyway, because I'd learned a long time ago that writing things down was how you dealt with them. Over the following 3 weeks, Judith built a file. She obtained the Bright Fork Properties LLC registration documents, traced the trust structure, and confirmed that Ryan was the sole beneficiary. She pulled the original deed to our building, in my name and Paulette's, joint tenancy with right of survivorship, recorded 1994. She documented the chain of events, the stroke, the rehab timeline, the date on the fraudulent signature, the gap between what I was medically capable of and what I supposedly agreed to. Meanwhile, Tiffany called me twice about transitioning back. She used that phrase each time, transitioning back, like I was a migratory bird being reintroduced to habitat. She wanted to schedule a family meeting about the restaurant's future direction. I told her I was still working with my doctors and needed a few more weeks. She said she understood completely, and her voice was warm and practiced in a way that reminded me of a hotel front desk at 2 a.m. I also made a phone call to Vic. He answered right away. We talked for 40 minutes. He told me that Tiffany had called him in for a meeting 2 weeks after my stroke, told him the restaurant was pivoting and his position was being restructured. She'd offered him a severance package and implied that if he didn't take it, there might be questions about his management of food costs over the years. There were no such questions. I knew every number in that kitchen. But Vic was 51 years old with a bad knee, and he took the severance rather than fight it. I should have called you, he said. I was in a rehab facility learning to walk a straight line, I told him. You had no reason to think I'd ever be in a position to do anything about it. There was a pause. Are you in a position now? I looked at my legal pad. Getting there. The family meeting Tiffany had proposed took place on a Saturday in March, at the restaurant after service. She'd set it up in the private dining room, which we used to reserve for birthday parties and rehearsal dinners. There was a presentation on a laptop, slides, actual slides, with a logo for something called MK Hospitality Group. Ryan sat at the head of the table. Tiffany was beside him with the laptop. Paulette sat next to me and held her own hands under the table. The presentation outlined a growth vision for expanding MK Kitchen and Bar into a multi-location concept across Tennessee and Georgia. There were projected revenue numbers, $4.2 million by year 3, and architectural renderings of 2 additional locations. There was a slide about legacy transition that explained how the Morrow family name would be preserved in the brand story, while the operational control shifted to the new entity. Bright Fork Properties LLC was on slide 9. They called it the holding vehicle. My name wasn't mentioned once. When Tiffany finished, she looked at me with that warm, practiced expression and said, "We wanted you to be part of this conversation, Charles. You built something wonderful here, and this is the natural evolution of that. I nodded slowly. I looked at Ryan. He was watching the tabletop. Can I ask a question? I said. Of course, Tiffany said. When was this holding company formed? A small hesitation. We set that up while you were recovering, to protect the business continuity. In the lease amendment? The one that transferred my building into the holding company's control for 49 years? Ryan looked up. I have a question about the signature on that document, I said. Because on the date it was signed, according to my neurologist's records, I had tested at a cognitive function level that my doctor characterized as, and I'm quoting here, insufficient for independent financial or legal decision-making. The room went very quiet. Tiffany's expression didn't change immediately. That's what I remember most. She'd prepared for a lot of things, but she hadn't prepared for this. Charles, she said carefully, you reviewed those documents when you were? I was in room 214 at Parkview Rehabilitation Center, I said. My occupational therapist's name is Donna. She can confirm that on the date your document was signed, I was in a session with her learning to use my left hand to open a jar of peanut butter. I set a folder on the table. I have documentation. Judith had suggested I bring printed copies of everything, and I had. Medical records. The LLC registration showing its formation date. The lease amendment with the disputed signature. A side-by-side comparison Judith had commissioned from a forensic document examiner, a man who'd spent 22 years with the FBI's Question Documents Unit, showing specific elements of the forged signature that didn't match my authentic signing patterns. Ryan stood up. Dad, sit down, son. He sat down. I placed each document on the table, one at a time. I took my time with it. My speech therapist had told me that when I felt stressed, I should slow down rather than push through. So I slowed down. I explained what each document was. I let the silence do the rest of the work. Tiffany's attorney, it turned out she had one on speed dial, which told me something, called within 2 hours of that meeting. Judith took the call. We were already 3 steps ahead. What happened after that was not a dramatic courtroom scene. There was no public confrontation. That was by design. Judith had advised me early on that the most effective leverage was the criminal exposure, and that most people with something to lose would settle well short of a prosecution. She was right. Ryan came to the house alone 2 nights later. He sat at my kitchen table, in the same chair Walt had sat in, and he looked like someone who'd aged 10 years since Saturday. Paulette made coffee and then left us alone. He told me that it had been Tiffany's idea. He said that like it explained something. I didn't argue with him about it. Did you forge my signature? I asked him. He was quiet for a long time. I let her use a signature stamp you'd made for the restaurant, for vendor invoices when you weren't available. I had a signature stamp. I'd forgotten about it. I'd had it made in 2017 because I traveled occasionally for trade shows, and Paulette needed to be able to process routine paperwork. It was kept in the office desk. Ryan, I said, I need you to understand something. This isn't about the money. The building, the lease, those things can be fixed. What I need to know is whether you understood what you were doing. He looked at his hands. Did you know I hadn't signed those documents? A very long pause. I told myself you would have. That was the most honest thing he said all evening. Judith and Tiffany's attorney negotiated for 11 days. The lease amendment was voided. Bright Fork Properties LLC was dissolved. Control of Morrow's kitchen, the building, the business, the name, reverted to me and Paulette without condition. Ryan remained as manager, on a proper employment agreement with a clear scope of authority. Tiffany stepped away from any operational role. As a condition of the settlement, I did not pursue criminal charges. This was the hardest decision I made. Judith told me I had a strong case. Dr. Bott was prepared to testify. The document examiner had already submitted a preliminary report. I thought about it for a long time. What decided it, finally, was a conversation I had with Paulette the night before I had to give Judith my answer. If you send her to prison, Paulette said, what happens to your grandchildren? She wasn't defending Tiffany. She wasn't excusing what happened. She was just asking the question I'd been avoiding. I thought about my granddaughter, who was 7, who called me Pop, who had made that banner with the backward E. I thought about what it would mean for her to grow up with her mother in prison because of something her grandfather decided. I called Judith in the morning and told her what I wanted. The first thing I did after the settlement was call Vic. He came back. Not immediately. He needed a few weeks to wind down a catering commitment he'd picked up. But he came back. And the day he returned to the kitchen was the first day I felt like myself since the freezer. We put the shrimp and grits back on the menu. We brought back the Sunday pot roast. We kept 3 items from the new menu that were actually good. I'm not sentimental to the point of stupidity, but the rest went. The sign above the door went back to dark green with gold lettering. I hired a woman who does historic signage restoration, and she matched the original as close as memory allowed. It wasn't exactly Paulette's handwriting, but it was close enough that Paulette cried a little when she saw it, and she'll tell you she didn't. The hardest part was the months that followed. Ryan came to work every day. We didn't talk about what happened, not directly, not for a long time. We talked about produce orders and staffing schedules and whether to extend our hours on Friday nights. We talked about the things that needed talking about. The other things sat in the corner of every room we were in together. One evening in June, about 4 months after the settlement, we were closing up and I found him in the office going through the vendor files. He looked up when I came in. "I'm sorry, Dad." He didn't say it like a man finishing a sentence. He said it like a man who'd been practicing it and wasn't sure if he'd gotten it right. "I know," I said. "That's not enough." "No," I said, "but it's a start. I've thought a lot about what I did wrong. Not in building the defense. I'm proud of how I handled that. But in the years before the stroke, I kept Paulette and Ryan involved in the restaurant without ever sitting down and explaining the whole picture. Ryan knew the business side of Morrow's Kitchen, but he didn't understand the ownership structure, the building, the financial history. I'd kept that close because I'd grown up watching my own father lose everything when he trusted the wrong people with the details. And somewhere along the way, I'd overcorrected. I'd built walls where I should have built windows. I don't know if that excuses what Ryan let happen. I don't think it does. But I understand now that silence can be its own kind of abdication. The restaurant turned 43 last spring. We had a party, the real kind. The kind with checkered tablecloths and too much food and people standing in the parking lot because there wasn't enough room inside. Vic made his pot roast. My granddaughter made a banner. All the letters forward this time, mostly. I gave a short speech. I didn't talk about the stroke or the lease or Bright Fork properties. I talked about the year my wife and I opened with 11 tables and a broken refrigeration unit and a prayer. I talked about 32 years of people coming through our door and becoming regulars, and regulars becoming something like family. I talked about what it means to build something that lasts. What I didn't say was what I'd learned about the difference between building and holding on. You can spend your life constructing something without ever teaching the people you love what it actually is or what it's worth. Not in dollars. In the other currency, the 32 years of 5 a.m. mornings, and a chef who stayed 19 years and a sign above the door in your wife's handwriting. The quietest power isn't in what you threaten. It's in what you've already built, long before anyone thought to take it.